Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's podcast. This week we're going to briefly touch on what we talked about in the last week with respect to women in esports, and we got a few other topics that we're going to talk about. Before I get started, I do want to say a huge thank you to everyone for listening and engaging in the conversation last week. Hopefully we can carry on with that trend and get people involved this week too. Now, down to some of the engagement that we had in our discussion last week about whether or not women are underrepresented in esports. It's very clear that opinion is divided on this topic. Now, the division doesn't seem to be whether or not they are underrepresented. The general consensus of opinion is that there are indeed less women in esports, and it'd be very hard to argue that point since there are clearly less women in esports. However, there do seem to be some mixed opinions regarding the reason for it and ways that we can engage better with women in esports to make it a more attractive proposition for them. On the one hand, the prevailing opinion seems to be that there are indeed less opportunities for women to get involved in esports. Now, the evidence supplied for this argument does seem to be largely anecdotal. That doesn't necessarily wipe out that argument, of course. It could be argued that women are struggling to get into the more competitive aspects of the amateur side of the game and thus are not given the opportunity to progress into the professional levels of the sport. However, again, it probably requires a little bit of investigation to figure out whether or not that's the case or why women are finding it harder to get into the amateur side of the game. I know that when I was a player of games like World of Warcraft, there were certainly plenty of people broadcasting in the global chat channels looking for people to partner up with. And there was certainly no public announcement of gender bias there was nobody broadcasting saying looking for a male member of an arena team or something like that. However, I was never one to apply for that sort of thing, so I couldn't possibly comment as to whether or not that were actually something that was happening perhaps in the selection process. I couldn't honestly say. Again, without any proper evidence on this topic, it's very difficult to have a proper debate where anything gets solved other than one group of people saying that they feel one way and another group of people saying that they feel the other. Very difficult topic to kind of resolve. The counter argument to that, of course, is that a lot of PvPers tend to feel that there is no gender bias, that when they're playing in an arena team or if they're playing even in a world PvP zone, that they don't feel or they don't really care what gender the people that they're playing with is, provided they do their job, provided they're actually a competent player. Now, again, this might just be because people individually have a narrow viewpoint and that they perhaps don't experience or don't witness any gender bias, but it may still exist. It may not. Honestly, I couldn't possibly say. Which does bring us to the minority contingent, whose opinion is no less valid than anybody else's, if we're being completely honest. There are a number of people who do feel there isn't any gender bias and that women are underrepresented purely through choice, and that those women who do want to play competitively are simply using this argument to try and gain some advantage, some easier access to the professional level of the sport. I don't honestly know. I think that's quite a cynical viewpoint. That doesn't necessarily say that it's not without merit, but it's one of those arguments that probably quite a dangerous one to have in this current climate. Needless to say, not a conversation that I will shy away from once I have sufficient number of people who want to participate in it. I am considering bringing on people maybe with differing viewpoints to have a friendly discussion about it. However, there is always a risk that those two people may have a falling out, so I'm going to certainly give that some thought. I don't record these things live, so it's not something that I couldn't rectify anyway, so something I'm going to consider. The next thing I wanted to talk about is actually a bit of a unique one. It's something that one of my colleagues brought to my attention the other day, because he knows that I deal with a lot of people who work in this particular field, and it's the subject of FinDom. Now, for those of you who don't know what FinDom is, it's essentially where a dominatrix demands money from, inverted commas, slaves, who send them money by way of tribute of varying sums for no services rendered whatsoever, by which I mean the dominatrix doesn't take their clothes off, they don't provide any sexual gratification to their quote-unquote slaves. But there is a element of, I would call it almost like a gambling addiction, where the slave enjoys the rush and they become addicted to it, and very soon they've sent hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, whatever. I've heard the argument used that there are ethical dominatrixes out there who don't take all of the money, they give some of it back. But essentially what it is men giving women money for nothing. Now, it isn't always women. Some these dominatrixes are gay or transgender people. And I would imagine that there probably are one or two men who manage to make a living doing it as well. But it does seem to be predominantly female dominatrixes using male slaves for this. In discussion with people from this area, from this neck of the woods, shall I say, the prevailing opinion among the dominatrixes seems to be that, well, if the men are willing to or wanting to give their money away, why should I turn it down? And on the face of it, it's hard to argue with that logic, because you think, well, yeah, I mean, if a guy wants to throw money at a woman, who's to say that he shouldn't? You know, as foolish as we might think that is, if that's their choice, and that's their choice. But when you delve a little bit deeper into it, there seems to be almost sociopathic removal of any kind of empathy from this situation, where that attitude really doesn't, or really does rather, conveniently ignore the fact that if someone has a gambling addiction, certainly in the UK, we treat that person as though they have a mental illness. In fact, there is now huge amounts of legislation for people who provide services for gamblers, you know, such as the bookkeeping office or the online casinos and things like that, where they have to carry out checks, and they're basically prevented from taking advantage of people who are dependent on gambling. Ignoring my earlier comments, I've actually done some research into this topic because it's something that I find to be absolutely fascinating. And it does turn out now that the large number of psychologists are starting to consider addiction to sex, and more importantly, addiction to FinDom, to actually be a mental illness. And there are actually now studies being carried out on men who either become addicted to financial domination, and even the types of characters who will spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on a model or a dominatrix's wish list on Amazon and things like that, because essentially what they're doing is putting themselves into huge financial trouble for absolutely no reason whatsoever, other than this strange fixation that they have on getting that little dopamine hit every time they feel like they've made this woman happy. I question the morality of the people who are on the receiving end of these financial gifts. Technically, it's just taking advantage of these people who have mental illnesses, and I haven't really got a firm opinion on this, but the more I think about it, the more I become convinced that realistically there's very little difference between this and the Hollywood meme of the loan shark who loans money to someone who they know isn't going to be able to pay it back, and it's taking advantage of people who have a problem. Now, I'm sure the argument could be made, of course, that they're doing what they need to do to survive, and anything that you need to do to survive is not, by definition, immoral. But most of these women, certainly the ones that I know personally and that I've witnessed online doing this kind of thing, they have plenty of other avenues of earning revenue, and mere survival is not the justification for doing it. They're simply doing it as an extra bit of pocket money that goes in. In fact, some women do so well out of this that they've basically paid off mortgages by getting money donated to them from these financial slaves. And there's certainly no argument that could be made there as to whether or not this is immoral. As far as I'm concerned, certainly it is completely immoral, because they are taking literally thousands of dollars away from people who may not even have that much money in the first place. They've just become addicted to and dependent on the dopamine hit they get when they give some of this money away. However, always open to have a discussion on the topic. Curious to find out what you guys think. Always really looking forward to engaging in a conversation about this. I would absolutely love it if anyone out there were doing financial domination from either side of the transaction, for want of a better way of wording that, and to include you in the show. So if you are either a financial slave or a financial dominatrix, feel free to get in touch and put your case forward, basically. Moving briefly and swiftly on to a topic more related to what this channel is actually about, and that is Skyblivion. Yes, the long awaited remake of Oblivion using the Skyrim engine, which when they started the project was cutting edge and is now 10 years out of date. However, regarding that, I am genuinely starting now to question whether or not this is ever going to happen, because they've been making it for such a long time. People such as myself have just gotten bored of waiting. I appreciate that making a game of this magnitude, when it's completely publicly funded, is going to take a very long time. Having said that though, the majority of the framework is already there. You've already got the game engine, you've already got the storyline, so all you're really doing is remaking assets in a more up-to-date environment and transposing the game content over into the new engine. Now, I don't know the complete ins and outs because I've never actually worked with that specific game engine, and they are treating it as a mod. However, it is taking a very long time. And as I said, I'm for one starting to wonder if it's ever coming out. And I'm being honest now, I'm actually starting to lose interest purely because by the time it comes out, Skyrim's Special Edition engine is going to be so far out of date that you might as well not worry about it. It's kind of like when recently in the last 2 years, the Master Chief Collection of the Halo games came out and we were promised all new updated, amazing looking graphics, and what we got was very slightly updated graphics that are still massively out of date. The Halo 1 remake was genuinely, I played it for 10 minutes and I got so fed up with it because it just wasn't what I had been promised, you know. So I just lost interest in it, and I haven't gone back to the Master Chief Collection at all, purely because I'm just frightened of being completely disappointed with all of the other remakes too. So yeah, looking forward to when we get an actual kind of release date announcement for that. All we seem to be getting at the moment is fobbed off with it's going to take as long as it takes, it's a mod, it's going to take forever, yada 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 yada. Definitely want to see it and hope that it comes out at some point before it becomes irrelevant. I did love playing Oblivion, I enjoy playing Skyrim more, and I'd very much like to see how Oblivion would look with slightly more attractive looking character models and lighting, etc. Lastly, I wanted to talk about a report on the BBC website recently about extremists using in-game chat on either live streams or actually in the games themselves to basically start the radicalization process of younger players. And what they're doing is they're including extremist narratives among everyday conversations and using that as a pathway to radicalization, such as live stream chats for games like Call of Duty, Minecraft, on platforms such as DLive. And they're talking about things like anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia. And basically what they're doing is they're converting people, or rather getting people to go from these live chats into private Telegram channels, at which point they start to manipulate that person. The radicalization process starts to happen. I think this is something that we all need to be aware of, largely because we don't want the governments to get involved in these kind of chats. If we can police them ourselves, and there's no reason for intervention. Certainly in the UK, our legal system, our law and order system relies heavily on the average everyday person doing their duty as a human being, so that the actual authorities don't need to get involved. So they're kind of a last ditch effort to try and recover the environment. So realistically, you need to be aware that it's happening, and you need to be able to recognize what the signs are of this happening. For example, people posting slightly ambiguous comments about these topics and inviting people to engage in these conversations. And this isn't talking about impinging on people's free speech. If you have an opinion about a certain kind of thing, then you absolutely have the right to discuss it. However, when these conversations are happening in environments where a lot of younger players, certainly children, are involved, then it could very easily become a situation where people are fishing for people to radicalize. And as I said, we need to be more on top of this kind of thing so that we don't have to hand over the keys to our live streams and to our in-game chats to the authorities. If you feel like having a conversation about any of the things that I've talked about in this live stream, if you want to get involved, if you have a strong opinion either way, then please feel free to get in touch. You can either do it in the comments section below, or if you want to, you can always reach me on the email realthundle@gmail.com, or you can reach me on Twitter as well. Twitter handle is on the banner above. Thanks ever so much for watching this, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below either way, and I will see you in the next one. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, all right? Bye-bye.